Today's story follows three tragic cases of young women whose lives were stolen during ordinary routines. First, the heartbreaking case of Mollie Tibbetts, a college student who vanished while jogging, sparking a nationwide search and a high-profile trial. Then, the mysterious disappearance of Hannah Graham, a university student who went missing after a night out, only for her case to expose a dangerous predator. Finally, the devastating murder of Karina Vetrano, a young woman attacked while jogging near her home, leaving her community shaken and desperate for justice. But before we begin, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place. We upload daily, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. On a warm July evening in 2018, the little town of Brooklyn, Iowa, nestled in the heartland of America, was winding down for the night. This was a town where people waved at strangers, where the rustle of cornfields was the loudest sound for miles, and where danger felt like a concept that only existed in the news. But that sense of safety was an illusion, and it was about to shatter. Mollie Tibbetts, a vibrant 20-year-old college student, was house-sitting for her boyfriend, Dalton Jack, while he was out of town working construction. She was spending the week taking care of the family dog, attending to her online summer coursework, and sticking to her fitness routine. That evening, as the golden light of the setting sun painted the streets of Brooklyn, Mollie laced up her running shoes, tied her hair back, and headed out for her usual jog. The town was calm as Mollie's feet hit the pavement, the rhythmic sound of her strides blending with the chirping of cicadas. She passed landmarks she knew by heart: the library, the post office, and the high school track where she sometimes sprinted. A warm breeze rustled the leaves on the trees lining the street, and Mollie felt at peace, her mind wandering as she jogged past neat little houses with porches illuminated by soft yellow lights. She waved at a neighbor mowing his lawn and smiled at a kid riding his bike down the block. At 7:30 p.m., Mollie sent Dalton a playful Snapchat, one of those everyday exchanges that had become a comforting ritual between the couple. Dalton opened the message later and smiled at the familiar sight of her bright face, unaware that it would be the last image of Mollie he would ever receive. As Mollie jogged past the edge of town and into the more secluded stretches of her route, the houses thinned out, replaced by expansive fields of corn and soybeans. It was the kind of isolation Mollie loved, quiet, serene, and free from distractions. But someone else was out there that night, watching her. Unbeknownst to Mollie, a black Chevy Malibu had been cruising the area. Its driver, Christian Bahina Rivera, was a 24-year-old farm worker who had been living and working in the area for several years. He later claimed that he noticed Mollie jogging and couldn't take his eyes off her. He began following her, driving slowly alongside her as she ran. Mollie, accustomed to the quiet safety of her small town, didn't notice the car at first. But when she finally did, her pace quickened. The realization that the car was trailing her sent a ripple of unease down her spine. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to paranoia, but the car persisted. Eventually, Rivera parked the car and got out. As he approached her, Mollie stopped and turned to face him, her phone in hand. "Leave me alone," she told him firmly. Her voice was calm, but resolute. When he continued to approach, she raised her phone higher and added, "I'm calling the police." Rivera later claimed that this angered him, and he blacked out. What happened in those next moments remained shrouded in mystery, but when Rivera came to, he found himself back in his car. He noticed something horrifying: a pair of earbuds and a bloodstain on the passenger seat. Panic set in. He drove aimlessly for a while, before making a decision he would later regret. Rivera drove to a secluded cornfield miles outside of Brooklyn. The rows of towering stalks provided a natural barrier, concealing what lay within. With chilling precision, Rivera carried Mollie's lifeless body into the field and left her there, hidden from view. Yeah. The next morning, when Dalton texted Mollie and received no response, he didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was busy with coursework or had gone out for a morning jog. But as the hours passed and her silence persisted, concern turned to panic. Dalton called her repeatedly, leaving voicemails that would never be returned. By the afternoon, he contacted Mollie's family. Something was wrong. Mollie wasn't the type to vanish without a word. Mollie's family reported her missing that evening, and the search began almost immediately. Her loved ones retraced her usual running route, calling out her name, scanning the ditches and cornfields for any sign of her. The effort grew as word spread. Soon, volunteers joined in, neighbors, coworkers, friends, and even strangers who simply wanted to help. The entire town seemed to rally around the Tibbetts family. Brooklyn became a hive of activity. People plastered flyers with Mollie's smiling face across storefronts and streetlights. Social media exploded with the hashtag #FindMollie, spreading her story far beyond the borders of Iowa. The local sheriff's office was inundated with tips and leads, each one fueling hope that Mollie would be found alive. Despite the community's tireless efforts, the days turned into weeks without a breakthrough. Investigators were methodical, following up on every lead, no matter how small. They analyzed Mollie's digital footprint, her phone records, her social media activity, and the GPS data from her Fitbit. But nothing seemed to point to her whereabouts. It wasn't until the FBI joined the case that a significant lead emerged. A homeowner along Mollie's running route had surveillance cameras installed on his property. The footage was grainy but clear enough to identify Mollie jogging along the road that evening. But it wasn't just Mollie that caught investigators' attention. It was the black Chevy Malibu. The footage showed the car circling the area multiple times, its movement slow and deliberate. Investigators worked quickly to identify the vehicle and its driver. Within days, they traced it back to Christian Bahina Rivera, who worked on a local dairy farm. When they questioned Rivera, he initially denied any involvement, claiming he knew nothing about Mollie's disappearance. But as the interrogation continued, Rivera's story began to unravel. His calm demeanor cracked, and he eventually admitted to following Mollie that night. What he told investigators sent chills through the room. The quiet tension of the investigation deepened as authorities turned their full attention to Christian Bahina Rivera. The 24-year-old farm worker, with his soft-spoken demeanor and unassuming presence, seemed an unlikely suspect to many. Yet, as investigators pushed him further, the cracks in his story widened, revealing a disturbing narrative that had eluded them for weeks. Rivera sat in the small, stark interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. Detectives pressed him with questions, cycling through the timeline of July 18th, the details of his day, and his movements that evening. At first, he answered calmly, sticking to a carefully crafted script. But the surveillance footage was irrefutable. The black Chevy Malibu had been seen multiple times on Mollie's jogging route, and there was no denying that Rivera had been driving it. When presented with the footage, Rivera's expression faltered. His shoulders slumped slightly, and the faintest tremor appeared in his voice. Slowly, the story began to unravel. He admitted to following Mollie in his car, explaining how he had seen her jogging and felt drawn to her. "She looked happy," he said quietly, his words hanging heavily in the air. But his account of what happened next was both chilling and confounding. Rivera claimed he had approached Mollie, parking his car and getting out to follow her on foot. When she noticed him, she turned to confront him, her phone in hand. Mollie had reportedly told him to leave her alone, warning that she would call for help. At this point, Rivera said something inside him snapped. He described a fog-like state overtaking him, one where he could not fully remember his actions. The next thing he claimed to recall was being back in his car, driving aimlessly with Mollie's belongings, a pair of earbuds and her phone, beside him. Investigators leaned in on this point, their questions becoming sharper and more pointed. "What happened in the cornfield?" one detective asked. Rivera hesitated, his eyes dropping to the table. Finally, after a long pause, he confessed to driving to a remote area and leaving Mollie there, concealed among the towering stalks of corn. He described the location with eerie precision, offering enough details to guide authorities to the spot. The next morning, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles made their way to the site Rivera had described. It was a secluded cornfield, the kind of place where the outside world felt impossibly far away. The team moved cautiously, their voices low as they combed through the dense rows. And then, there she was. Mollie's remains were discovered hidden deep within the field, a tragic confirmation of the fears her family and community had been grappling with for weeks. The discovery sent shockwaves through Brooklyn. The once hopeful search turned into a devastating reality. Mollie's family, who had held on to the faintest glimmer of hope that she might still come home, were now faced with the unimaginable. The town, which had rallied so fiercely to find her, was plunged into mourning. As the details of Rivera's confession became public, emotions ran high. How could someone who lived and worked among them, who had walked the same streets and shared the same community, be capable of such an act? The questions multiplied, and with them, the public's anger and grief. But Rivera's confession was far from the end of the story. As the investigation continued, inconsistencies in his account began to emerge. Forensic teams scoured his car, the cornfield, and other locations linked to him, piecing together a timeline that often contradicted his version of events. While his confession placed him at the scene, key elements remained vague or entirely absent. Forensic evidence became a critical focus. Mollie's Fitbit, which had been tracking her activity up until the moment she vanished, provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. The data revealed her heart rate and movement patterns, showing the exact moment her body had gone still. This timeline aligned with Rivera's account of the evening, but left open questions about what had occurred during those final minutes. In addition to the Fitbit data, Mollie's phone records painted a partial picture of her last moments. Text messages, social media activity, and GPS logs were analyzed, providing breadcrumbs for investigators to follow. Together, these digital trails offered glimpses into Mollie's life, but also underscored the haunting reality of how quickly and inexplicably she had disappeared. Meanwhile, the public's fascination with the case reached a fever pitch. News outlets from across the country descended on Brooklyn, turning the quiet town into a media circus. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, outside Rivera's workplace, and even outside the homes of Mollie's grieving family. The story dominated headlines, sparking debates and discussions that extended far beyond Iowa. Amid the storm, Rivera's legal team began to mount a defense. His attorneys argued that his confession had been coerced, obtained under duress after hours of questioning. They pointed to his lack of a criminal record, his steady job, and his otherwise unremarkable background as evidence that he could not have committed such a heinous act. The narrative they spun was one of a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a scapegoat for a community desperate for answers. But the evidence told a different story. DNA samples taken from Mollie's body matched Rivera's profile, tying him directly to the scene. The surveillance footage of his car circling the area placed him in proximity to Mollie during her final moments, and his own admission, though contested, remained a damning piece of the puzzle. As the case moved toward trial, the tension in Brooklyn was palpable. The community that had once come together in a spirit of hope and unity was now fractured, grappling with the dark reality of what had happened in their own backyard. Rivera's arrest and confession brought some semblance of closure, but it was a far cry from the resolution many had hoped for. Mollie Tibbetts' name became synonymous with the fragility of safety, a stark reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn extraordinary, and how one moment can change everything. Yet, for all the answers that had been uncovered, there were still so many questions. The search for justice was far from over. As the case against Christian Bahina, Rivera moved forward, the details of his confession and the subsequent discovery of Mollie Tibbetts' body began to dominate headlines nationwide. Investigators and legal experts scrutinized every aspect of the case, piecing together a chilling timeline of events while grappling with the unanswered questions Rivera's statements left behind. After Rivera's arrest, his legal team argued that his confession was incomplete and obtained under intense pressure. They claimed he had been interrogated for hours without adequate breaks, casting doubt on the validity of his admissions. These arguments set the stage for a contentious trial, one that would pit forensic evidence against Rivera's shifting account of what happened the night Mollie vanished. Law enforcement began assembling their case with meticulous care. The cornfield where Mollie had been found became the focus of an exhaustive forensic analysis. Technicians worked in painstaking detail, cataloging evidence and mapping the scene inch by inch. Among the stalks of corn lay the remnants of Mollie's last moments, providing a grim snapshot of what she endured. Key pieces of evidence emerged from the cornfield. Fibers from her clothing, impressions in the soil, and biological traces all told a story, one that painted Rivera as a central figure. Investigators also focused on Rivera's car, the black Chevy Malibu that had been seen trailing Mollie. The vehicle was impounded, and subjected to a battery of tests, including luminol sprays that revealed trace evidence invisible to the naked eye. Each discovery added another link in the chain of evidence, tying Rivera to the crime. Despite these findings, Rivera maintained a selective memory of the events. He admitted to following Mollie but insisted he had experienced a blackout and could not recall what transpired during that critical time. His defense team seized on this ambiguity, framing him as a man who may have been present but did not act with intent. They argued that without a complete confession or direct witness testimony, the case against him was circumstantial. However, technology told a different story. Mollie's Fitbit, a small yet powerful device she wore religiously during her runs, became a key piece of evidence. Investigators retrieved data from the device that tracked her heart rate, physical activity, and location. The Fitbit's timeline showed a sudden dramatic spike in Mollie's heart rate followed by a rapid decline, coinciding almost exactly with the time Rivera admitted to encountering her. Further bolstering the prosecution's case was the surveillance footage of Rivera's car. Analysts enhanced the grainy video to identify specific movements, demonstrating that the vehicle had circled Mollie multiple times before stopping. The footage was a stark visual confirmation of Rivera's presence along Mollie's jogging route, contradicting his initial claims that he had merely driven through the area without stopping. As these details came to light, the public's reaction was swift and visceral. Rivera became the target of widespread condemnation, his image plastered across news outlets as the face of a horrific crime. Yet, as his story unfolded, it became clear that the case was not as straightforward as it seemed. In a surprising turn, Rivera's defense team introduced an alternative theory. They claimed that Rivera had been coerced by unidentified individuals who had threatened him and his family. According to this new narrative, Rivera had been ordered to dispose of Mollie's body under duress, fearing for his life if he refused. While investigators found no evidence to support this claim, it added an unexpected twist to an already complex case. The trial preparation became a balancing act of forensic precision and emotional resonance. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the evidence, the DNA matches, the surveillance footage, the Fitbit data, to construct a narrative that was both compelling and airtight. They also worked closely with Mollie's family, preparing them for the emotional toll of testifying and reliving the worst moments of their lives. Mollie's father, Rob Tibbetts, became a central figure in the public discussion surrounding the case. He spoke with poise and dignity, balancing his personal grief with a determination to honor Mollie's memory. In interviews and public appearances, Rob emphasized Mollie's kindness, her resilience, and her love for life, painting a vivid picture of the young woman the world had lost. As the trial date approached, the atmosphere in Brooklyn grew tense. The media presence intensified, with reporters camping outside the courthouse and following every development. For the Tibbetts family, the ordeal was a constant reminder of their loss, but they remained steadfast in their pursuit of justice. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, outlining the evidence against Rivera and promising to reveal the full scope of his actions. Their first witnesses were law enforcement officials who had worked the case, providing detailed testimony about the investigation process and the evidence they had uncovered. The jury listened intently as the prosecution methodically laid out its case. They presented the Fitbit data, highlighting the precise moment Mollie's heart rate spiked and then fell silent. They played the surveillance footage, pointing out Rivera's car as it followed Mollie. And they introduced DNA evidence, confirming that Rivera's genetic profile matched samples found at the scene. But the most emotional moments came when Mollie's family took the stand. Her mother, Laura Calderwood, spoke through tears as she described the last conversation she had with her daughter. Her testimony was a poignant reminder of the human cost of the crime, a stark contrast to the clinical analysis of forensic evidence. Rivera's defense team worked to counter these narratives, focusing on the alleged inconsistencies in the investigation. They questioned the validity of Rivera's confession, arguing that it had been obtained under questionable circumstances. They also emphasized a lack of direct evidence proving Rivera's intent, casting doubt on whether he had acted alone or even willingly. The trial stretched on for weeks, with each day bringing new revelations and intensifying emotions. The courtroom became a battleground of facts and feelings, with the prosecution and defense vying for the jury's belief. Outside, The town of Brooklyn watched anxiously, waiting for the verdict that would decide Rivera's fate. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the overwhelming weight of the evidence, arguing that Rivera's actions were deliberate and devastating. The defense, meanwhile, appealed to the possibility of doubt, suggesting that Rivera's role was more complex than it appeared. When the jury was finally sent to deliberate, the room fell silent. Days of testimony and evidence had built to this moment, and the outcome would determine not only Rivera's future, but the closure that Mollie's family and community so desperately sought. The jury's deliberation stretched into hours, and then days, leaving everyone involved in the trial suspended in a state of tense anticipation. For the Tibbetts family, each passing moment was an agonizing reminder of their loss and their yearning for justice. The courtroom, once filled with the hum of arguments and witness testimonies, now sat silent and expectant, awaiting the verdict that would determine the fate of Christian Bahina Rivera. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled with a collective intake of breath. Rivera sat stoically at the defense table, his expression unreadable, as the foreperson handed the sealed envelope to the judge. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge opened it, the tension palpable in the air. "Guilty," the foreperson announced, her voice clear and firm. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Mollie's family clutched one another tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Their long fight for justice had reached a pivotal moment. For Rivera, the verdict marked the beginning of the next chapter in his life, one that would unfold within the walls of a prison. He showed little reaction, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. As the news spread, the town of Brooklyn was gripped by a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the man responsible for Mollie's death had been held accountable, but sorrow that no verdict could ever bring her back. The trial had laid bare the tragedy and horror of what had happened, leaving scars on the community that would take years to heal. But even with a guilty verdict, the case was far from over. Rivera's defense team immediately announced their intention to appeal, citing procedural errors and what they described as a lack of substantial evidence proving Rivera's intent. They raised questions about the circumstances surrounding his confession, reiterating their claim that it had been obtained under duress. In the weeks following the trial, Rivera's attorneys worked tirelessly to prepare their appeal. They doubled down on their argument that Rivera had not acted alone, pointing to supposed inconsistencies in witness testimonies and gaps in the investigation. The defense even attempted to introduce new theories, including claims that other individuals may have been involved in Mollie's disappearance. Meanwhile, the Tibbetts family continued to process their grief. In the wake of the trial, they made a conscious decision to focus on Mollie's life rather than her death. Rob Tibbetts, ever the steady voice of the family, spoke publicly about their plans to establish scholarships and community programs in Mollie's honor. "Mollie was a bright light in this world," he said in an interview. "We want her legacy to be one of hope, resilience, and love." But for all the efforts to move forward, the shadow of the case lingered. The appeal process brought renewed scrutiny to the evidence and the investigation, forcing Mollie's family to relive the trauma again and again. The defense's arguments centered on their claim that Rivera had been framed or coerced, a theory that was met with skepticism by many, but still managed to cast a sliver of doubt in some minds. At the heart of the appeal was Rivera's claim that two unidentified men had approached him on the night of Mollie's disappearance, threatening his safety and forcing him to comply with their demands. Rivera alleged that these men had committed the act and later ordered him to dispose of Mollie's body. Investigators found no corroborating evidence to support this claim, but the defense seized on it as a potential avenue for sowing doubt. Prosecutors, however, stood firm in their original case. They presented the same evidence that had led to Rivera's conviction: the surveillance footage, the DNA matches, and Rivera's own admission that he had been at the scene. They argued that the new claims were nothing more than a desperate attempt to avoid accountability, designed to muddy the waters rather than reveal the truth. The appeal process was long and grueling, with hearings and motions dragging on for months. For Mollie's family, it was a painful reminder that the justice system, while necessary, often prolongs the suffering of those it seeks to serve. Still, they remained steadfast in their belief that the truth would prevail. Throughout this time, the media's attention on the case began to wane. The once constant presence of reporters in Brooklyn faded as the public's focus shifted to news stories. But for the Tibbetts family, the loss of Mollie remained as raw and immediate as ever. Her absence was felt in every quiet moment, every family gathering, every milestone she would never get to experience. In an effort to channel their grief into something positive, the family launched the Mollie Tibbetts Foundation, dedicated to promoting safety and supporting victims of crime. They organized community events, spoke at schools about personal safety, and worked tirelessly to ensure that Mollie's memory would be one of inspiration rather than tragedy. Yet, even as the Tibbetts family worked to build something meaningful from their pain, the questions surrounding Rivera's case continued to loom. The appeals process brought renewed speculation and debate, with some questioning whether justice had truly been served. For others, the case served as a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of vigilance. As the legal battles wore on, one thing remained certain. Mollie Tibbetts had left an indelible mark on everyone who knew her, and on a nation that had followed her story so closely. Her life, though tragically cut short, became a symbol of resilience and hope in the face of unimaginable loss. And even as the courtroom dramas continued, her family's love and strength stood as a testament to the enduring power of memory and the human spirit. The years following the verdict brought a profound sense of reflection for everyone touched by Mollie Tibbetts' story. In Brooklyn, Iowa, her name was spoken with reverence, not just as a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded, but as a symbol of hope and resilience. Mollie had become more than a victim. She had become a force for change. Her family, unwavering in their determination to honor her memory, poured their energy into initiatives that reflected Mollie's values. The Mollie Tibbetts Foundation grew rapidly, organizing events that brought communities together and raised awareness about personal safety. It wasn't just about preventing future tragedies. It was about fostering a sense of connection, the kind that Mollie had always championed in her life. One of the foundation's first major initiatives was the establishment of a scholarship fund in Mollie's name. The scholarship was awarded to students who embodied the qualities that had defined Mollie: kindness, determination, and a passion for learning. Each recipient carried a piece of Mollie's legacy with them, their achievements a testament to her enduring influence. At the same time, conversations surrounding safety and vigilance began to take root in schools, workplaces, and homes across the country. Mollie's story became a case study in the importance of community vigilance and personal preparedness. Workshops on situational awareness and self-defense were organized in her honor, empowering individuals to take proactive steps to protect themselves and others. But for all the positive change inspired by Mollie's legacy, the road ahead was not without its challenges. The appeals process for Christian Bahina, Rivera continued, reigniting public debate each time a new motion was filed or a hearing was held. For Mollie's family, these moments were painful reminders of the ongoing nature of the justice system, a system that, while necessary, often prolonged their grief. Rivera's legal team continued to argue that he had been coerced into confessing, and that his version of events, which implicated unnamed individuals, should be given greater weight. These claims, though unsupported by evidence, created a ripple of doubt that some latched onto. But for the majority of those following the case, the overwhelming forensic and circumstantial evidence left little room for ambiguity. As Rivera's appeals played out in court, the focus of the Tibbetts family remained steadfastly on the future. Rob Tibbetts, in particular, became a prominent voice in discussions about community safety and the way society could better protect its most vulnerable members. He traveled across the country, speaking at events and sharing Mollie's story not as a cautionary tale but as a call to action. "Every one of us has the power to make our communities safer," Rob said during one of his speeches. "It starts with looking out for one another, with refusing to let fear dictate our lives, and with remembering that we all have a role to play." The Tibbetts family's strength became a beacon of hope for others who had experienced similar losses. They received letters and messages from people across the country, sharing their own stories of grief and resilience. Many found solace in Mollie's story, drawing inspiration from the way her family had turned their pain into a force for good. Over time, Mollie's story became woven into the fabric of the community. A mural was painted in her honor, depicting her radiant smile surrounded by symbols of her passions: books, running shoes, and sunflowers. The mural became a gathering place for locals and visitors alike, a place to reflect, remember, and celebrate the light Mollie had brought into the world. The foundation also launched an annual event called Mollie's Run, a community-wide 5K that combined two of her greatest loves, running and bringing people together. The event drew participants from across the state and beyond, turning what could have been a somber occasion into a celebration of life, resilience, and unity. In the years that followed, Mollie's influence extended far beyond Brooklyn. Her story sparked conversations about personal safety, the power of community, and the enduring impact of kindness. Schools incorporated lessons on situational awareness into their curriculums. Businesses implemented new safety protocols for their employees, and communities organized neighborhood watch programs to foster a sense of collective responsibility. But perhaps the most profound impact was the way Mollie's story reminded people of the importance of cherishing every moment and every connection. For those who had followed her story, she became a symbol of how precious and fleeting life can be, and how even in the face of unimaginable loss, love and resilience can shine through. As the legal battles surrounding Rivera's case began to wane, Mollie's family found themselves in a place of quiet reflection. The fight for justice had been long and arduous, but their focus had always been on ensuring that Mollie's life was remembered for the joy she brought, not the way it ended. And in that mission, they had succeeded. Brooklyn, Iowa, returned to its quiet rhythm, but the town was forever changed. The streets where Mollie had once jogged were now a part of her story, a reminder of a life that had touched so many. For the Tibbetts family, the work of honoring Mollie continued, not just through their foundation and community efforts, but in the simple act of carrying her spirit forward in their everyday life. Mollie Tibbetts had been a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a light to everyone who knew her. Though her time on Earth had been far too short, her impact would be felt for generations. Her story was one of love, loss, and resilience, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the strength of the human spirit. And as her family, friends, and community carried her legacy forward, they ensured that Mollie's light would never be extinguished. It would continue to shine, a beacon of hope and a reminder of the beauty and fragility of life. The next story is called Vanished at Night. On the warm evening of September 12, 2014, in the heart of Charlottesville, Virginia, the streets were alive with the energy of a bustling college town. The University of Virginia campus pulsed with activity as students poured out of bars and restaurants, their laughter and chatter blending with the sounds of passing cars and distant music. Among them was 18-year-old Hannah Graham, a bright and adventurous second-year student. That night, she had planned to let loose, to join her friends for an evening of fun after the pressures of college life. Hannah had sent a few texts to her friends, coordinating where they'd meet. Her outgoing nature and infectious energy made her a magnet in any social circle, and she was eager to join the lively crowd that filled the bars and streets near the downtown mall. By 9:00 p.m., she was seen with friends at an apartment off campus, sharing laughs and enjoying the night. But as the hours passed, the night began to unravel in ways no one could have anticipated. By midnight, Hannah had separated from her group. It wasn't unusual. In the chaos of a college town's nightlife, friends often split up only to reconnect later. Text messages pinged back and forth between her and her friends, trying to track each other down in the crowded streets. At 12:55 a.m., Hannah sent a text to one friend, "I'm lost." That message, seemingly innocent at first, would later become the haunting echo of a night that spiraled into tragedy. As the bars began to close and the streets emptied, Hannah's presence on security cameras became the thread investigators would later cling to. At 1:00 a.m., footage captured her walking along Charlottesville's downtown mall, a popular pedestrian area filled with shops and restaurants. She appeared to be unsteady on her feet, weaving slightly as she walked. Was she lost? Disoriented? The questions would plague those who reviewed the footage in the days that followed. At 1:06 a.m., another camera caught Hannah walking past a Shell gas station, heading east. She seemed to be alone, her head turning occasionally as if searching for someone or something. By 1:20 a.m., she was seen again, this time in the company of a man later identified as Jesse Matthew Jr., a local resident with a history that would send shivers down the spines of those who came to learn it. Jesse was a towering figure, physically imposing but deceptively charismatic. In the footage, he walked beside Hannah, his body language relaxed, almost protective. Witnesses later described seeing the two together, with Jesse's demeanor seemingly friendly. He offered her assistance, convincing her that he could help her find her way home. Hannah, vulnerable and unaware of the danger she was in, appeared to trust him. The pair disappeared from view shortly after. The footage would mark the last time Hannah Graham was seen alive. As the sun rose the next morning, Hannah's absence began to raise alarms. Friends tried to contact her, their calls and texts going unanswered. By midday, her parents, John and Susan Graham, received a call no parent ever wants to hear. Hannah's friends reported her missing, explaining that she hadn't returned to her apartment or responded to any messages. The Grahams, who lived in Northern Virginia, immediately drove to Charlottesville, their hearts heavy with dread. By the evening of September 13th, the Charlottesville Police Department officially classified Hannah as a missing person. The investigation began in earnest, with officers canvassing the areas where she was last seen. Flyers with her photo, her bright smile and confident gaze, were distributed throughout the city. Social media lit up with posts and hashtags as the community rallied to find her. But for those closest to the case, the search felt like chasing shadows. Each passing hour without a lead deepened the fear that Hannah was in grave danger. Detectives pored over the security footage from the downtown mall, piecing together a timeline of her movements. The image of Jesse Matthew walking beside her became the focal point of their investigation. His face, though not yet identified, was unmistakable, a man with a distinct build and a confident stride. Who was he? And where had he taken her? Witnesses who had been near the downtown mall that night were questioned. Some remembered seeing Hannah, her striking red hair and youthful energy making her hard to miss. A few mentioned the man she was with, describing him as approachable, even charming. But none could provide a name or a definitive account of where they had gone. The case took a chilling turn when detectives identified Jesse Matthew from the footage. His name was familiar to local law enforcement, tied to past incidents that had raised suspicions but never led to convictions. As they delved into his background, they uncovered a pattern, whispers of encounters that had left others uneasy, accusations that hinted at a dark side carefully hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. On September 15, police visited Jesse's apartment. He agreed to speak with them, his demeanor cooperative but guarded. He admitted to being with Hannah that night, claiming he had offered her a ride home but denied any wrongdoing. His car, a burnt orange Chrysler, was searched, and forensic experts began their meticulous examination. They found traces of fibers and DNA that would later become key pieces of evidence. But Jesse was not immediately arrested. Investigators needed more concrete proof that tied him to Hannah's disappearance. As the search continued, volunteers combed through the wooded areas and rural roads surrounding Charlottesville. Helicopters scanned the terrain, their rotors slicing through the air as search dogs sniffed for any sign of Hannah. The sheer scale of the effort was staggering, a testament to the community's determination to bring her home. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in Charlottesville was palpable. The discovery of a pair of pants resembling those Hannah had been wearing added a new layer of urgency. Found near an abandoned property, the pants were sent to a lab for testing, the results awaited with bated breath. But as leads dried up, hope began to waver. The breakthrough came on October 18th, when human remains were discovered in a heavily wooded area about 10 miles from where Hannah had last been seen. The site was remote, hidden from plain sight, as if someone had deliberately chosen it to conceal a dark secret. Forensic teams descended on the scene, carefully documenting and collecting evidence. Dental records would later confirm what everyone had feared. The remains belonged to Hannah Graham. The discovery was devastating, but not entirely unexpected. For weeks, her family and friends had prepared themselves for the possibility that she would not be found alive. But the confirmation of her fate brought a new wave of grief, mingled with a fierce determination to see justice served. As the investigation shifted from a search for a missing person to a homicide case, the focus on Jesse Matthew intensified. His DNA, collected from the fibers found in his car, was matched to the remains of Hannah Graham. The evidence was damning, a connection that left no room for doubt. But as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling connection to another unsolved case, the 2009 disappearance of Morgan Harrington, a Virginia Tech student whose remains had been found under similarly grim circumstances. The realization sent shockwaves through the community. Jesse Matthew was no longer just a suspect in Hannah's case. He was now linked to a pattern of violence that spanned years. The hunt for answers had only just begun. The search for Hannah Graham was nothing short of monumental. By the morning of September 13, 2014, her disappearance had transformed from a worrying absence to a full-scale investigation. Friends and family, initially hoping she had simply stayed over at a friend's place or lost her phone, were now gripped by dread. The hours ticked by with no sign of her, and what began as quiet concern quickly escalated into an urgent cry for help. The Charlottesville Police Department responded with the seriousness the situation demanded. Missing persons cases in college towns could be tricky. Many involve students who turned up after a night out or an impromptu trip to a friend's house. But from the outset, there was something different about Hannah's case. Her friends described her as responsible, unlikely to go off the radar without letting someone know. Her parents, John and Susan Graham, were adamant. This was not like their daughter. Investigators moved quickly, retracing Hannah's last known steps. The downtown mall, normally a bustling hub of activity, now became the epicenter of the search. Officers pored over hours of surveillance footage, piecing together her movements through the cobblestone streets and alleyways. The images were haunting. Hannah, walking alone, occasionally glancing over her shoulder. The timestamp on the footage was a cruel reminder of how little time had passed since her disappearance, yet how quickly the trail was growing cold. The last image of Hannah, captured at 1:20 a.m., was etched into the minds of everyone working the case. In it, she was seen alongside a man later identified as Jesse Matthew Jr. The footage showed him walking beside her, his posture calm, his steps unhurried. At first glance, there was nothing overtly alarming about the interaction. But the context, the fact that Hannah had been texting her friends moments earlier, saying she was lost, made this encounter deeply unsettling. Witnesses who had been in the area that night were interviewed, but their recollections were frustratingly vague. A bartender remembered seeing a woman who might have been Hannah, describing her as looking confused or disoriented. Another individual recalled a man matching Jesse Matthews' description near the downtown mall. His demeanor friendly, but persistent, as he interacted with a woman. These fragments of information painted a picture, but it was incomplete. Each new detail seemed to raise more questions than answers. By September 15th, the search had expanded dramatically. Volunteers joined law enforcement officers, combing through parks, wooded areas, and abandoned properties. The efforts were coordinated and methodical, but the terrain around Charlottesville was vast and unforgiving. Helicopters scanned the dense forests, while search dogs were deployed to cover ground inaccessible to vehicles. Every lead, no matter how tenuous, was pursued. Social media played a crucial role in spreading awareness. Posts about Hannah's disappearance went viral, with thousands of people sharing her photo and details about her last known whereabouts. Hashtags, like #FindHannah, became rallying cries for a community desperate for answers. Tips began pouring in, some credible, others outlandish. Each one was carefully logged and investigated, but the overwhelming majority led to dead ends. The Grahams, thrust into the public eye, displayed a resilience that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. John Graham, a quiet and composed man, stood before cameras, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. His voice, steady but strained, carried the weight of a father's worst nightmare. "We need your help," he said. "If you know anything at all, please come forward. Our daughter's life may depend on it." Behind the scenes, the investigation began to focus on Jesse Matthew. His presence in the surveillance footage, coupled with witness accounts, made him the most significant lead in the case. Detectives ran his name through their databases and uncovered a troubling history. While he had no major criminal convictions, there were reports of past incidents, disturbing encounters that hinted at a pattern of behavior. Police visited Jesse's apartment on September 19. He agreed to speak with them, his demeanor cooperative but guarded. He admitted to being with Hannah on the night she disappeared, claiming he had offered her a ride because she seemed lost and upset. He insisted he had dropped her off near her apartment and had no idea what happened afterward. His story, while plausible, raised red flags. The timeline he provided was inconsistent with the surveillance footage, and his vague recollection of details seemed rehearsed. Jesse's car, a burnt orange Chrysler, was impounded for forensic examination. Inside, investigators found fibers and other materials that were sent to the lab for testing. The results, while not immediate, would later become critical to building the case against him. But for now, Jesse remained a person of interest, not a suspect. The police had to tread carefully. They needed hard evidence to move forward. Meanwhile, the search efforts continued. The community's response was overwhelming, with hundreds of volunteers joining daily to search for Hannah. The camaraderie and determination were palpable, but so was the growing sense of despair. Each day without a breakthrough felt like a step further from finding her alive. On September 21st, a possible breakthrough occurred. A pair of pants resembling those Hannah had been wearing was discovered near an abandoned property on the outskirts of Charlottesville. The area was cordoned off, and forensic teams were dispatched to examine the site. The discovery reignited hope, but it was tempered by the grim possibility that they were no longer searching for a missing person, but for remains. The media coverage intensified, with national outlets picking up the story. Hannah's disappearance became a lightning rod for discussions about safety on college campuses and the dangers faced by young women. Why? Her story struck a chord with people across the country, many of whom saw their own daughters, sisters, or friends in her. As the days turned into weeks, the focus on Jesse Matthew sharpened. On September 24th, an arrest warrant was issued for him on charges unrelated to Hannah's disappearance, providing police with the legal grounds to take him into custody. But Jesse had disappeared. A nationwide manhunt ensued, with law enforcement agencies across the country joining the search. Jesse was located on September 30 in Galveston, Texas. He had fled over 1,000 miles from Charlottesville, his car abandoned along the way. The circumstances of his capture were almost anticlimactic. A man who had eluded a massive search found alone, with no means of escape. He was extradited to Virginia, where he faced mounting evidence linking him to Hannah's case. Back in Charlottesville, the Grahams awaited news with a mixture of hope and dread. The discovery of human remains on October 18 brought the investigation to a devastating turning point. Found in a heavily wooded area near a rural road, the remains were confirmed through dental records to be Hannah's. The search was over, but the pain of her loss had only just begun. The arrest of Jesse Matthew Jr. was a moment of relief for the community of Charlottesville, but for law enforcement, it was only the beginning of uncovering the truth. The Graham family had spent weeks in the grip of uncertainty, their lives suspended in an unbearable limbo. Now, with Jesse in custody, investigators were determined to leave no stone unturned to piece together the events of September 12, 2014, and the secrets that Jesse's past might hold. The forensic examination of Jesse's car had already yielded troubling findings: fibers consistent with Hannah's clothing, DNA evidence suggesting physical contact, and soil samples that hinted at his presence near a remote wooded area. But it was the discovery of Hannah's remains on October 18 that brought a devastating finality to the search and shifted the investigation into overdrive. The secluded site where her body was found told its own story, one of meticulous concealment and calculated decisions. The area was dense with foliage, accessible only by unmarked trails, a place someone might choose if they wanted to ensure they were never found. Forensic teams worked tirelessly at the scene, documenting every detail. The remains were transported to a nearby lab, where forensic pathologists began the painstaking process of determining a cause of death. Each clue, no matter how small, was a piece of the puzzle. Soil embedded in her clothing was analyzed for geographic markers, and microtraces of pollen were examined to confirm her movements. While the forensic findings built a timeline, they also underscored the brutality of what had occurred. Detectives turned their attention to Jesse's background. Meanwhile, his life, once an enigma, was now laid bare under the scrutiny of investigators. Jesse had grown up in the area, attending local schools and showing promise as an athlete. But his promising trajectory had been marred by troubling incidents. Records revealed accusations of inappropriate behavior during his time at two separate colleges. These accusations had not led to convictions, but they painted a picture of a pattern, a man whose charm masked a dangerous side. The link to Morgan Harrington's case brought this pattern into sharp focus. Morgan, a 20-year-old Virginia Tech student, had disappeared in October 2009 after attending a Metallica concert in Charlottesville, D.C. Her remains were discovered months later in a remote field, her case unsolved for years. Now, DNA evidence tied Jesse Matthew to her murder. The parallels between Morgan and Hannah's cases were chilling. Both young women had vanished in the same area under eerily similar circumstances, and both had been found in remote rural locations. Investigators began to wonder, could there be more victims? The question haunted those working the case, spurring a review of cold cases in Virginia and beyond. Patterns emerged: unsolved disappearances of young women, cases with few leads and no resolutions. Jesse's DNA was run through national databases, and while no additional matches were immediately found, the possibility lingered that he had been involved in other crimes that had gone unnoticed. As the evidence against Jesse mounted, his behavior became increasingly erratic. During interviews, he alternated between calm defiance and visible agitation. He denied any involvement in Hannah's disappearance, insisting that he had merely offered her a ride because she looked lost and vulnerable. Yet, his story shifted under questioning, details becoming inconsistent. Detectives pressed him about the surveillance footage, the fibers, the DNA, but he provided no explanations that could account for the damning evidence. Jesse's legal team worked frantically to build a defense, focusing on casting doubt on the forensic evidence. They argued that the fibers could have been transferred unintentionally, that the DNA could have been contaminated. They sought to paint Jesse as a victim of a rush to judgment, a man wrongfully accused in a case that had captivated national attention. But the sheer weight of the evidence against him made these arguments increasingly implausible. The public, meanwhile, was transfixed by the unfolding case. News outlets provided near-constant coverage, dissecting every development and speculating on what might come next. The discovery of Hannah's remains and the connection to Morgan Harrington reignited conversations about safety, justice, and the broader societal factors that had allowed a predator to operate undetected for so long. Advocates for survivors of violence used the case to call for systemic changes, including better coordination between colleges and law enforcement when dealing with allegations of misconduct. The impact on the University of Virginia community was profound. Students, faculty, and staff came together to honor Hannah's memory, holding vigils and organizing events to promote awareness about personal safety. Counseling services were expanded, and campus safety initiatives were strengthened. But for many, these measures felt like too little, too late. A reaction to tragedy rather than a proactive effort to prevent it. As the investigation continued, the focus shifted to constructing a timeline of Jesse's actions on the night of Hannah's disappearance. Surveillance footage, cell phone records, and witness accounts were painstakingly pieced together to map his movements. The timeline revealed a chilling sequence of events: Jesse leaving the downtown mall with Hannah, his car traveling to rural areas outside Charlottesville, and his eventual return to his apartment in the early hours of the morning. Each detail was corroborated by physical evidence, weaving a narrative that left little doubt about his involvement. The case against Jesse was bolstered by the discovery of additional items linked to Hannah near the wooded area where her remains were found. A piece of fabric, later confirmed to be part of her clothing, was recovered along with a discarded phone case bearing her initials. These items, combined with the forensic evidence from Jesse's car, created a web of connections that was impossible to ignore. As the weeks turned into months, the weight of the case began to take its toll on everyone involved. For Hannah's family, the grief was overwhelming, compounded by the slow grind of the legal process. For investigators, the pressure to deliver justice was unrelenting. Each new discovery brought a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, a step closer to the truth, but also a stark reminder of the violence that had taken Hannah's life. The case also reignited debates about the role of forensic science in the justice system. While the evidence against Jesse was compelling, it also highlighted the limitations and challenges of relying on physical evidence in complex investigations. Experts debated the reliability of DNA analysis, the potential for contamination, and the ethical considerations of using forensic genealogy to identify suspects. These discussions underscored the high stakes of the case, where even a small error could have far-reaching consequences. As Jesse sat in his cell, awaiting trial, the world outside continued to grapple with the implications of his actions. His arrest had brought a measure of closure to the Graham and Harrington families, but it had also opened a Pandora's box of questions about the broader societal failures that had allowed him to evade accountability for so long. For those who knew Hannah and Morgan, the pain of their loss was a constant presence, a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that could exist in plain sight. The trial of Jesse Matthew Jr. began under the weight of intense scrutiny. By the time jury selection was complete and the courtroom opened its doors, the case had become a national story, drawing attention not only for its harrowing details, but for the broader questions it raised about justice, safety, and the hidden dangers within seemingly ordinary lives. For Hannah Graham's family, the trial represented the culmination of a painful journey, a chance to find some semblance of closure while seeking accountability for their daughter's fate. The courtroom was a charged space, the air thick with the tension of unresolved grief and righteous anger. Jesse sat at the defense table, flanked by his legal team, his expression inscrutable. Across the aisle, Hannah's parents maintained a dignified composure, their faces etched with the weight of the last year. The prosecution, led by a determined team of attorneys, approached the case with a clear strategy to present an overwhelming tapestry of evidence that left no doubt about Jesse's culpability. The trial opened with the timeline of Hannah's final hours. The prosecution painstakingly reconstructed her movements through surveillance footage, text messages, and witness accounts. Each frame of video was presented in chronological order, drawing a vivid picture of her interactions on the night of September 12, 2014. The footage of Jesse walking alongside Hannah, his posture casual yet deliberate, became a focal point. The prosecutor emphasized how Jesse had positioned himself as a helpful figure, gaining her trust in a moment of vulnerability. Forensic evidence formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Experts testified about the fibers recovered from Jesse's car, linking them to Hannah's clothing. The DNA evidence, presented in excruciating detail, left no room for ambiguity. Scientists explained the processes used to collect, analyze, and match the samples, ensuring the jury understood the rigor of their methods. Diagrams, charts, and photographs filled the courtroom, each one a piece of a puzzle that painted Jesse as the perpetrator. The prosecution's narrative was bolstered by the discovery of Hannah's remains and the items found near her. Photographs of the wooded area where she was found were displayed, the grim images accompanied by testimony from forensic pathologists. They described the condition of her remains, the environmental factors that had affected them, and the timeline they suggested. It was a clinical recounting, but the emotional weight was inescapable. Each word seemed to deepen the collective sorrow of those in the courtroom. Witnesses also played a critical role. Friends of Hannah testified about her character and the events leading up to her disappearance, providing context for the timeline. Individuals who had seen her on the night in question described her as appearing disoriented but not alarmed, an observation that aligned with her text messages to friends about being lost. These testimonies underscored her vulnerability and framed Jesse's actions as predatory. The defense, however, sought to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. They challenged the reliability of the forensic evidence, questioning whether the fibers and DNA could have been transferred through innocent contact. They raised the possibility of contamination during the collection and testing process, suggesting that the evidence might not be as conclusive as it appeared. Their arguments were technical, aimed at introducing doubt rather than presenting an alternative narrative. Jesse's legal team also focused on his background, portraying him as a man with no prior convictions and a history of being unfairly targeted. They argued that he had cooperated with police initially and that his decision to flee was driven by fear rather than guilt. It was a strategy designed to humanize him, to paint him as a flawed but ultimately misunderstood individual caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The most dramatic moments of the trial came during cross-examinations. When the forensic experts were questioned, the defense lawyers scrutinized every detail of their methodology, looking for inconsistencies. They questioned the chain of custody for the evidence, suggesting that gaps in documentation could have allowed for errors. The exchanges were tense, with the prosecution pushing back forcefully, defending the integrity of their case. The emotional crescendo of the trial came when Hannah's parents took the stand. Their testimonies were not about evidence, but about loss, the immeasurable pain of losing their daughter and the enduring impact on their life. John Graham spoke with quiet intensity, describing Hannah's kindness, her aspirations, and the void her absence had left. Susan Graham's voice wavered as she recounted the moment she learned her daughter was missing, the sleepless nights that followed, and the heartbreak of knowing she would never come home. The jury listened intently, their expressions a mix of sorrow and resolve. These testimonies were a reminder that the trial was not just about facts and figures, but about a life that had been stolen and the ripple effects of that loss. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides made their final arguments. The prosecution summarized the evidence with a compelling narrative, tying together the forensic findings, the timeline, and Jesse's actions. They emphasized the patterns in his behavior, pointing to his connection to Morgan Harrington's case as evidence of a broader history of violence. "This is not about speculation," the lead prosecutor said. "This is about accountability." The defense, in their closing argument, urged the jury to focus on the gaps in the case. They argued that the prosecution had failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, that the forensic evidence was not as conclusive as it seemed, and that Jesse deserved the presumption of innocence. Their tone was measured but insistent, an appeal to the possibility of error in a system that is not infallible. The jury's deliberation was agonizing for everyone involved. Days passed with no word, each moment stretching the tension to its breaking point. The Grahams remained in the courthouse, their expressions a blend of hope and apprehension. Reporters camped outside, their updates filling news feeds and broadcasts. The community waited with bated breath, knowing the verdict would shape the narrative of justice for Hannah Graham. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was silent. The foreperson stood, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of the decision. The verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. Jesse Matthew Jr. was convicted of first-degree murder, abduction with intent to harm, and other related charges. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Hannah's parents embraced, tears streaming down their faces. The prosecution team exchanged solemn nods, their expressions a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Jesse sat motionless, his face betraying no emotion as the gravity of the moment sank in. For the Graham family, the verdict was a step toward healing, but not an end to their grief. They left the courthouse knowing that justice had been served, but that the hole in their lives could never be filled. The community, too, felt a sense of closure, though the lingering questions about safety and accountability remain. The trial of Jesse Matthew Jr. was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning with the darkest corners of human behavior and the resilience of those left in its wake. As the courtroom emptied and the story moved into its next chapter, one truth remained. Hannah Graham's light, though extinguished too soon, would continue to shine in the hearts of those who loved her. When the courtroom doors finally closed, the echoes of the trial reverberated far beyond Charlottesville. For the Graham family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it also underscored the finality of their loss. Hannah was gone, and no punishment could change that. The silence in their home was a constant reminder of the vibrant energy she once brought into their lives. Her laughter, her curiosity, her dreams, all of it had been taken. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was a determination to ensure that her story would not be forgotten. Hannah's parents, John and Susan Graham, became tireless advocates for awareness and safety. They believed that Hannah's tragedy could serve as a catalyst for change, a rallying cry to protect others from similar harm. In the months following the trial, they worked with local organizations and national advocacy groups, speaking at events and sharing their story. They emphasized the importance of vigilance, community support, and systemic change, hoping to create a legacy for their daughter that transcended the pain of her loss. The University of Virginia, where Hannah had been a student, also took steps to honor her memory. Scholarships were established in her name, aimed at supporting students who embodied her spirit of compassion and intellectual curiosity. Memorial events brought together classmates, faculty, and community members who shared stories of the impact Hannah had on their lives. These gatherings were not just about mourning. They were celebrations of the person she had been and the light she had shared with the world. For Charlottesville, the case left an indelible mark. The city, often known for its charm and close-knit community, now carried the weight of two tragic stories: Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington. The connections between the two cases had not only led to Jesse Matthews' conviction, but also raised critical questions about patterns of violence and the societal gaps that allowed them to persist. Law enforcement agencies across Virginia and beyond began to re-examine unsolved cases with new scrutiny. Jesse Matthews' DNA profile, now part of national databases, was cross-referenced with evidence from cold cases. While no definitive links to other crimes emerged immediately, the possibility lingered, casting a shadow over the investigations. The chilling thought that there could be more victims haunted those who had worked tirelessly to bring justice to Hannah and Morgan. Forensic technology also came under the spotlight, with experts debating its role in modern investigations. The advancements that had helped solve these cases were celebrated, but they also prompted critical discussions about their limitations. How reliable was DNA evidence in isolation? What safeguards were needed to prevent misuse or error? These questions became central to broader conversations about justice and fairness, sparking reforms and new guidelines in forensic practices. Hannah's case also ignited a wave of campus safety initiatives. Universities across the country implemented new measures to protect students, including enhanced security protocols, self-defense workshops, and resources for students navigating nightlife in college towns. Social media campaigns encourage students to adopt safety strategies, such as traveling in groups and sharing their locations with trusted friends. These efforts, while important, were bittersweet, reminders of a tragedy that should never have happened. For John and Susan, their advocacy work became both a mission and a coping mechanism. They traveled to colleges and universities, speaking to students about the importance of awareness and personal safety. Their presentations were honest and heartfelt, often bringing audiences to tears. They shared memories of Hannah, not as a victim, but as a person full of life, love, and potential. Their goal was clear: to honor her memory by helping others avoid the pain they had endured. Jesse Matthew, now serving multiple life sentences, faded from the headlines, but the questions surrounding his actions lingered. Psychologists and criminal behavior experts analyzed his case, trying to understand what might have driven his behavior. Reports surfaced of his troubled past, marked by allegations of inappropriate behavior and unaddressed warning signs. These revelations sparked debates about accountability, not just for Jesse but for the institutions and systems that had failed to intervene earlier. For the Harrington family, Jesse's conviction brought long-awaited closure. Morgan's disappearance in 2009 had left a deep scar, and for years, her parents had fought to keep her memory alive while demanding answers. Now, with Jesse behind bars, they joined the Grahams in their advocacy efforts, united by shared grief and a determination to make a difference. The impact of these cases extended far beyond Virginia. National conversations about violence, personal safety, and systemic accountability gained new momentum. Advocacy groups pushed for reforms in how cases of missing persons and assaults were handled, calling for better training for law enforcement and more resources for survivors. The stories of Hannah and Morgan became rallying points for change, their names evoking both heartbreak and hope. Despite the progress, the Graham family's journey was far from over. Every anniversary, every holiday, every ordinary day carried the weight of Hannah's absence. They found solace in small things: her favorite songs, the places she loved to visit, the laughter of her friends who continued to cherish her memory. These moments were reminders of who she was, not just how her life had ended. In time, the Grahams established a foundation in Hannah's name, dedicated to supporting young women in pursuing their dreams and fostering a culture of safety and respect. The foundation became a source of healing for the family, a way to channel their grief into something meaningful. Through scholarships, community programs, and partnerships with advocacy groups, they ensured that Hannah's legacy would continue to inspire and protect others. The community of Charlottesville, too, found ways to heal. Vigils turned into annual events celebrating resilience and unity. The downtown mall, once a site of sorrow, became a place of remembrance, with plaques and markers honoring Hannah and Morgan. These tributes served as quiet reminders of lives lost but not forgotten, their stories woven into the fabric of the city. As the years passed, the case of Hannah Graham became more than a true crime story. It became a testament to the power of community, the advancements of forensic science, and the enduring strength of those left behind. For her family and friends, the pain of her loss would never fade completely, but neither would the light she had brought into the world. Hannah's name became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, there is room for change, for healing, and for love. Her story, though marked by darkness, also illuminated the best of humanity: the compassion of strangers, the perseverance of justice, and the resilience of those who carry on her legacy. And in that light, Hannah Graham's memory would continue to shine. The next and final story is called Danger in the Park. On a warm August evening in 2016, the kind of evening where the air is thick with summer's final grip, Karina Vetrano slipped on her running shoes, tied the laces tight, and prepared for what she expected to be an ordinary jog. The trail she planned to take, winding through Spring Creek Park in Howard Beach, Queens, was one she'd traversed countless times before. It was a place she knew well, a mix of overgrown greenery and unkempt marshland that offered an escape from the urban sprawl of New York City. But that evening, the familiar would become the unthinkable. Karina was vibrant, strong, and determined. Her daily runs were her sanctuary, a way to decompress after a day working as a speech pathologist. Her father, Phil Vetrano, was often her running partner, their shared jogs a cherished routine. But on this evening, Phil's back injury kept him at home. As she grabbed her keys and headed for the door, she reassured him, "I'll be fine, I won't be long." It was a promise she had every intention of keeping. By 6 p.m., Karina was jogging along the edges of Spring Creek Park, her ponytail swaying with each stride, the rhythmic crunch of her sneakers on the dirt path blending with the symphony of cicadas and rustling leaves. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that danced across the trail. To anyone passing by, it was a picture of serenity, a young woman lost in her thoughts, the world around her a blur. But the deeper she ventured into the park, the thicker the air seemed to grow, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to keep secrets. Somewhere along that trail, it happened. What exactly occurred in those harrowing moments is a puzzle of evidence and speculation, but the aftermath spoke volumes. Karina encountered someone who didn't belong there, someone whose intentions were as dark as the park's deepest shadows. The struggle was ferocious, desperate, the kind of fight born from a primal instinct to survive. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Back at home, Phil waited. Minutes ticked by, each one louder than the last. Karina was punctual to a fault, and her absence was a silent alarm. He called her phone once, twice, 3 times. Each time, the call rang unanswered. A knot of worry formed in his stomach, twisting tighter with every passing second. By 8 p.m., Phil's worry erupted into action. He grabbed a flashlight and headed for the park. The entrance to Spring Creek was unwelcoming in the fading light, the trails narrowing into dark corridors framed by wild brush. Phil moved quickly, his steps driven by an urgency only a parent could understand. "Karina!" he called, his voice cutting through the stillness. The only response was the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic from the parkway. He found her phone first, lying discarded in the dirt. Its screen was cracked, the case scratched as though it had been hurled to the ground. His breath hitched. This wasn't like her. Karina wouldn't drop her phone. Not here, not ever. The flashlight beam trembled as he swept it across the path, and then he saw it, a patch of trampled grass leading into the dense undergrowth. His heart pounded as he pushed through, calling her name again and again. And then, he saw her. Karina's body lay twisted in the tall grass, her vibrant energy reduced to a chilling stillness. Her clothing was torn, and bruises marred her skin. Phil fell to his knees, the flashlight clattering to the ground. The world tilted, and the weight of reality crashed down on him. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this to his daughter. When the first police units arrived, the scene was immediately cordoned off. Detectives worked methodically, marking every footprint, every strand of disturbed grass, every sign of the violent encounter that had unfolded. The forensics team swarmed the area, their latex gloves glinting under the harsh beams of portable lights. A sense of urgency filled the air, mingling with the unmistakable tension of disbelief and outrage. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment painted a horrifying picture. Karina had fought with everything she had. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms were evidence of a struggle that was as desperate as it was devastating. Whoever had attacked her had been ruthless, and the final moments of her life were marked by terror and pain. The investigation began immediately, but the challenges were daunting. Spring Creek Park was vast and dense, a natural labyrinth with countless hiding spots and potential escape routes. Detectives canvassed the area, questioning anyone who might have seen something, joggers, dog walkers, even residents from nearby neighborhoods. But the answers were few, and the questions seemed infinite. The DNA evidence collected from Karina's body and clothing was the most promising lead. It didn't match anyone in the criminal database, but it was a start. Somewhere out there, a person walked free who had left their trace behind. The detectives were determined to find them, but determination was no match for the looming uncertainty. The clock was ticking, and every hour without an arrest felt like justice slipping further away. Meanwhile, the community of Howard Beach was rocked to its core. This was a place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other's names and routines. Now, that sense of security was shattered. Parents clung to their children a little tighter, eyes lingered on strangers a little longer, and Spring Creek Park became a no-man's land. Karina's family was thrust into the spotlight, their grief magnified under the relentless glare of the media. Phil Vetrano, once a hero as a New York firefighter, now found himself in an unimaginable role. His interviews were raw and heartbreaking, his voice trembling as he spoke of Karina's vibrant spirit and the void her absence had left. The police held on to hope. The DNA was a roadmap, and somewhere along the way it would lead them to answers. But for now, all they had were questions. Who was in Spring Creek Park that evening? Who had crossed paths with Karina, and why had they chosen violence? The park held its secrets tightly, the trees and trails silent witnesses to a crime that had left a community forever changed. Hours turned to days, and the case remained unsolved. The trail seemed to grow colder with each sunrise, but the detectives refused to let go. They combed through every piece of evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and expanded their search radius. The answers were out there. They had to be. The investigation that followed Karina Vetrano's tragic death was as intense as it was unrelenting. The crime scene told a story, a violent, desperate struggle, but the narrative it painted was incomplete, riddled with questions. Detectives had to work with what little they had: fragments of evidence, the DNA of an unidentified suspect, and a haunting silence from the very park that had swallowed the truth. The team knew they were working against the clock. In cases like this, the first 48 hours were critical, but the brutality of the crime had complicated the initial investigation. Spring Creek Park was sprawling, its trails winding through dense marshland and overgrown vegetation. It wasn't the kind of place that gave up its secrets easily. Phil Vetrano, who had been the one to discover his daughter's body, became a driving force in the search for answers. His heartbreak was palpable, but so was his determination. He spoke with detectives daily, offering insights into Karina's habits and routine, hoping to unearth even the smallest clue that could point to the person responsible. His voice, often trembling with emotion, carried the weight of a father's unbearable loss and unwavering resolve. Detectives scoured the park, returning to the scene day after day in search of something, anything, that might have been overlooked. The area where Karina had been found was combed with forensic precision. They documented every blade of trampled grass, every faint indentation in the dirt. The trail of disturbed vegetation suggested a struggle, one that had moved from the main path into the denser brush. It was here, surrounded by silence and shadows, that the attack had reached its grim conclusion. The DNA evidence was their most promising lead. It had been recovered from Karina's body and clothing, clear and uncontaminated, a rare gift in a case like this. But when it was run through the National DNA Database, the results came back empty. The suspect wasn't in the system. It was a devastating setback, but not an insurmountable one. Advances in forensic science had made it possible to trace familial connections through DNA, a process that could identify relatives of an unknown individual. The detectives knew it was a long shot, but it was a shot worth taking. As the forensic team worked to unravel the mystery of the DNA, other officers turned their attention to the neighborhood surrounding Spring Creek Park. They knocked on doors, distributed flyers, and questioned anyone who might have been in the area that evening. Residents were shaken. Howard Beach was a close-knit community, a place where people felt safe. Karina's murder had shattered that sense of security, replacing it with fear and suspicion. Some neighbors offered vague accounts of hearing noises, a scream perhaps, or the rustling of bushes, but nothing concrete. One woman described seeing a man walking near the park entrance around the time of the crime. He had seemed out of place, she said, his demeanor anxious, his movements hurried. But her description was too vague to be useful. She couldn't remember his face, his clothing, or even the direction he'd been heading. It was a frustrating dead end, one of many the detectives would encounter. Surveillance footage became the next focus. Cameras from nearby businesses and traffic intersections were pulled, and hours of grainy video were painstakingly reviewed. One clip showed a shadowy figure entering the park just before sunset. Another captured a vehicle idling near the entrance around the same time. The footage was too blurry to provide definitive answers, but it added to the growing sense that whoever had done this had entered the park deliberately, not by chance. The media quickly picked up on the case, turning Karina's murder into a citywide story. Her face, framed by a bright smile and shining eyes, appeared on television screens and newspaper covers. Reporters described her as a vibrant, ambitious young woman whose life had been cruelly cut short. The coverage was both a blessing and a curse for the investigation. It kept the case in the public eye, generating tips and leads, but it also added immense pressure to solve it quickly. Every dead end became a headline, every delay a source of public frustration. Phil Vetrano used the media attention to his advantage. He appeared at press conferences and on news programs, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. His voice, though strained with grief, carried a determination that resonated with the city. "Someone out there knows something," he said. "Please, help us find who did this to Karina." But as the days turned into weeks, the trail seemed to grow colder. Tips continued to pour in, but most led nowhere. Some were outright fabrications, the work of people seeking attention or inserting themselves into the narrative. Others were well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful, like the report of a man who claimed to have seen Karina jogging that evening. His account was detailed at first, but under questioning, it fell apart. His timeline didn't match, and his description of the park was inaccurate. It was another false lead, another waste of precious time. Despite the setbacks, the detectives pressed on. They revisited the crime scene, re-examined the evidence, and followed up on every tip, no matter how small. The DNA remained their best hope, and progress was being made on that front. The genealogical analysis had identified potential relatives of the suspect, narrowing the field to a specific demographic. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a step forward. The investigation also began to focus on a series of prior incidents in the area. There had been reports of disturbances in and around Spring Creek Park, instances of harassment and strange behavior that, in hindsight, seemed chillingly similar to what had happened to Karina. One report described a man who had followed a jogger through the park, his intentions unclear but unsettling. Another mentioned a figure seen lurking near the trails at dusk. The descriptions varied, but there were enough similarities to warrant further scrutiny. Karina's family watched the investigation unfold with a mixture of hope and despair. They were grateful for the detectives' dedication, but frustrated by the lack of answers. Every day, without an arrest, felt like an eternity, a reminder of the justice that had yet to be served. For Phil, the fight became a mission. He refused to let his daughter's case fade from the public consciousness, speaking out at every opportunity, ensuring that Karina's name remained at the forefront of people's minds. The community rallied around the Vetrano family, organizing vigils and fundraisers in Karina's memory. Hundreds gathered to light candles, share stories, and demand justice. But beneath the surface, fear and anger simmered. The residents of Howard Beach had always prided themselves on their tight-knit, supportive community. Now, that pride was mixed with suspicion. People looked at their neighbors differently, wondering who could be trusted and who might be hiding something. As the weeks turned to months, the pressure on the detectives intensified. They knew the public was growing restless, that the media was losing patience. But they also knew that rushing the investigation could jeopardize everything. They had to be thorough, methodical, and above all, relentless. The answers were out there, they just had to find them. The break came after months of relentless pressure, when the investigation into Karina Vetrano's murder was teetering on the edge of despair. The DNA evidence had been their strongest lead from the beginning, and it was this meticulous science that eventually cracked the case open. Familial DNA, a technique still relatively new in its application, had led investigators to a specific lineage. After weeks of cross-referencing genealogical records and eliminating dead ends, they zeroed in on a name, Chanel Lewis. Chanel wasn't someone who had previously been on the radar. He had no major criminal record, no significant run-ins with law enforcement. By all appearances, he was quiet, reserved, and largely kept to himself. But his proximity to the crime scene and his family's connection to the DNA hit placed him firmly in the spotlight. Investigators began to piece together a timeline, digging into his background and movements around the time of Karina's murder. The decision to bring Chanel in for questioning was a calculated move. Detectives knew they needed to handle it carefully, One wrong step could jeopardize everything they had worked for. Chanel was approached at his home, and although he appeared nervous, he agreed to accompany them to the precinct for questioning. It was during this initial conversation that the cracks began to show. Chanel's demeanor was quiet but anxious. He shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact as detectives asked about his whereabouts on the evening of Karina's murder. At first, his answers were vague. He couldn't recall specific details about the day, claiming it was just like any other. But when pressed further, his responses began to falter. The detectives noticed his hands fidgeting, his voice growing softer with each question. Then, almost without prompting, Chanel mentioned that he had been to Spring Creek Park before. He described walking through the trails, a place he said he visited occasionally to clear his mind. The detective seized on this detail. They pressed him, asking whether he had been in the park on the evening in question. His response was hesitant. "I might have been." This vague admission was enough to escalate the situation. Chanel agreed to provide a DNA sample, which would later become the irrefutable evidence tying him to the crime. But the detectives weren't ready to stop there. They continued to question him, and over the course of several hours, his story shifted and evolved. Eventually, he made a shocking statement. "I was there." The room went silent. Chanel's admission wasn't a full confession, but it was a crack in the wall of denial he had maintained up to that point. He claimed he had wandered the park that evening, restless and aimless, but insisted he had no involvement in Karina's death. The detectives didn't believe him, but they knew they needed more to solidify their case. As Chanel's DNA sample was sent to the lab for comparison, investigators began to piece together his movements. Surveillance footage from a nearby street showed a figure matching his description entering the park around the time of the crime. Witnesses who had previously described a man acting suspiciously in the area now seemed to recall details that aligned with Chanel's appearance. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. When the DNA results came back, they left no doubt. The sample recovered from Karina's body and clothing was a perfect match to Chanel Lewis. It was a breakthrough that sent shockwaves through the precinct. After months of chasing shadows, they finally had their suspect. The arrest was swift and decisive. Chanel was taken into custody, and the charges were announced. Murder, with additional charges related to the violent nature of the crime. The news spread quickly, dominating headlines and reigniting the media frenzy that had surrounded the case from the beginning. For the Vetrano family, the arrest brought a sense of relief, but also a new wave of grief. Knowing the name of the person responsible didn't ease the pain of their loss. It simply gave it a sharper focus. As the case moved toward trial, the spotlight shifted to the evidence. The DNA match was the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument, bolstered by Chanel's own inconsistent statements during questioning. But the defense team wasted no time in mounting their counter-arguments. They claimed that Chanel's confession had been coerced, that he had been subjected to hours of intense questioning without proper legal representation. They also questioned the integrity of the DNA evidence, suggesting the possibility of contamination. The trial itself was a spectacle, capturing the attention of the entire city. Each day brought new revelations as witnesses took the stand and experts presented their findings. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculated crime, using the DNA evidence and Chanel's own words to build their case. They described Karina's final moments in harrowing detail, emphasizing the struggle that had taken place in the overgrown brush of Spring Creek Park. Chanel's defense team focused on casting doubt. They brought in their own forensic experts to challenge the DNA analysis, arguing that the methods used were prone to error. They highlighted Chanel's quiet demeanor, suggesting he was incapable of such a violent act. They pointed to his lack of a criminal history, framing him as an unlikely perpetrator. For Karina's family, the trial was a grueling ordeal. Each day in court brought fresh reminders of the life that had been stolen from them. They listened as experts dissected the evidence, as lawyers argued over the validity of Chanel's confession. They sat through testimony that painted a vivid and painful picture of what Karina had endured. The jury deliberated for days, weighing the evidence and the arguments presented by both sides. In the end, they reached a unanimous verdict: guilty. Chanel Lewis was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a moment of justice, but it was also a somber reminder of the cost of that justice. For the Vetrano family, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but the scars of their loss would never fully heal. They had fought tirelessly to ensure that Karina's voice was heard, that her story was not forgotten. And now, as they faced the future without her, they carried her memory with them, a memory that would continue to inspire those who knew and loved her. The courtroom was silent as the trial began, the weight of the case palpable in the tense air. The murder of Karina Vetrano had shocked the city, and now, as the legal proceedings unfolded, the nation was watching. Chanel Lewis sat quietly at the defense table, his expression neutral, his hands clasped in front of him. Across the room, Karina's family sat resolutely, their pain etched on their faces but their determination unshaken. They had waited years for this moment, a chance to see justice served. One towel. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They opened with the DNA evidence, a cornerstone that they argued left no room for doubt. The forensic team had meticulously collected samples from Karina's body and clothing, and the match to Chanel Lewis was undeniable. The science was clear, they said, and it painted a damning picture of the events that had unfolded in Spring Creek Park that fateful evening. The lead prosecutor described Karina as a vibrant, compassionate young woman whose life had been stolen in an act of unimaginable violence. They recounted her final moments, detailing the struggle that had been pieced together through forensic analysis. Bruises and scratches on her arms and hands spoke to her desperate fight to escape her attacker. The images were stark, the narrative devastating. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the prosecutor described the brutality of the crime. But the defense wasn't about to concede. Their opening arguments painted a very different picture of Chanel Lewis. They described him as a quiet, misunderstood individual with no history of violent behavior. They argued that he had been targeted unfairly, his confession coerced, and the evidence mishandled. Their strategy was clear: sow doubt in the minds of the jurors, chip away at the certainty of the prosecution's case. Chanel's confession became a focal point of the trial. The prosecution played excerpts of his recorded interview, where he admitted to being in Spring Creek Park on the evening of the murder. In one chilling moment, he described an altercation, his words halting but clear. The confession, the prosecution argued, was genuine, a spontaneous admission of guilt. But the defense countered by calling into question the circumstances under which the confession had been obtained. They pointed to the length of the interrogation, Chanel's lack of legal counsel at key moments, and his apparent confusion during parts of the interview. They argued that he had been pressured, that his words were the product of exhaustion and coercion, rather than a true recounting of events. The DNA evidence, too, came under scrutiny. The prosecution brought in forensic experts to explain the process of collecting, analyzing, and matching the samples. The experts spoke confidently, describing the precision of their methods and the irrefutable match to Chanel Lewis. But the defense sought to undermine this confidence, questioning the chain of custody of the evidence and raising the possibility of contamination. They called their own forensic specialists to testify, experts who suggested that the samples could have been compromised or that the statistical probabilities presented by the prosecution were overstated. For Karina's family, these arguments were agonizing. They had placed their faith in the justice system, in the evidence that had led to Chanel's arrest. Hearing the defense attack that evidence, cast doubt on the DNA match, and challenge the legitimacy of the confession felt like a reopening of old wounds. But they remained resolute, attending every day of the trial, their presence a testament to their unwavering commitment to their daughter's memory. The trial also featured testimony from those who had been involved in the investigation. Detectives recounted the painstaking process of piecing together the case, from the initial discovery of Karina's body to the identification and arrest of Chanel Lewis. They spoke of the challenges they had faced, the false leads they had pursued, and the breakthrough that had come with the DNA match. Their words painted a vivid picture of the determination and dedication that had driven the investigation. Witnesses took the stand as well, including those who had seen a man matching Chanel's description near the park on the evening of the murder. Their accounts were often fragmented, memories blurred by time and the emotional weight of the case. But, taken together, they added to the prosecution's narrative, placing Chanel in the area at the critical moment. Throughout the trial, Chanel remained mostly silent, his demeanor calm and subdued. His defense team painted him as a victim of circumstance, a scapegoat for a community desperate for answers. They highlighted his lack of a criminal record, his quiet life, and his apparent confusion during his interactions with law enforcement. They argued that the case against him was built on shaky ground, a rush to judgment rather than a pursuit of the truth. As the trial entered its final days, both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecution implored the jury to focus on the evidence, the DNA match, the confession, the timeline that placed Chanel Lewis in Spring Creek Park at the time of Karina's murder. They spoke of justice, of the need to hold accountable the person who had taken Karina's life. "The evidence doesn't lie," the lead prosecutor said. "Chanel Lewis was there. Chanel Lewis committed this crime." The defense, in contrast, urged the jury to consider the possibility of doubt. They pointed to the inconsistencies in the confession, the questions surrounding the handling of the DNA evidence, and the lack of a clear motive. They painted Chanel as a young man caught in a tragic situation, his life upended by a flawed investigation. The jury deliberated for days, the weight of their decision evident in their somber expressions as they filed in and out of the courtroom. For Karina's family, the wait was agonizing. They had spent years seeking justice, enduring the pain of their loss while the investigation and legal proceedings unfolded. Now, the final outcome was out of their hands. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was packed, the tension so thick it felt almost suffocating. Chanel Lewis stood as the jury foreperson read the decision, guilty on all counts. The room erupted in emotion, tears from Karina's family, a collective sigh of relief from the community members who had followed the case so closely. Chanel remained stoic, his face unreadable as the reality of his conviction sank in. The sentencing hearing that followed was equally charged with emotion. Karina's parents addressed the court, their voices trembling as they spoke of the daughter they had lost, the vibrant young woman whose life had been stolen. They described the pain of waking up every day without her, the void that would never be filled. "Our Karina was taken from us in the most cruel and senseless way," Phil Vetrano said. "And while no sentence can bring her back, we are grateful that justice has been served." Chanel Lewis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Vetrano family, it was a moment of closure, a resolution to the long and painful journey they had endured. But it was also a reminder of the cost of justice, the life that had been lost, and the scars that would never fully heal. As the courtroom emptied and the legal proceedings came to a close, one truth remained: Karina's story was far from over. Her legacy lived on, not only in the memories of those who loved her, but also in the determination of a community to ensure that her life and her loss would never be forgotten. As the courtroom emptied and the trial came to a close, the weight of the journey that had led to this moment hung heavily in the air. The verdict was clear, and Chanel Lewis would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Karina Vetrano's family, justice had been served. But justice, they quickly realized, was not the same as healing. It did not erase the pain, nor did it fill the void left by her absence. It was at best a resolution to one chapter of a story that would continue to shape their lives. Karina's parents, Phil and Kathy Vetrano, returned to their Howard Beach home with a bittersweet sense of finality. The house, once filled with the sounds of Karina's laughter and energy, now felt quieter than ever. Every corner was a reminder of her, the books she had read, the photographs she had taken, the vibrant presence that had once made their home so alive. And yet, amidst the pain, there was a quiet determination to ensure that her memory endured. In the weeks following the trial, the Vetrano family became vocal advocates for victims' rights. Phil, who had been so instrumental in keeping the case in the public eye, continued to use his voice to demand change. He spoke at community meetings, urging neighbors to be vigilant and proactive in keeping their neighborhoods safe. He partnered with local organizations to raise awareness about personal safety, particularly for women who enjoyed outdoor activities like running or hiking. His message was clear: no one should have to experience what his family had endured. Kathy, who had largely stayed out of the public eye during the investigation and trial, found solace in quieter forms of advocacy. She helped establish a foundation in Karina's name, dedicated to supporting young women pursuing careers in the arts and sciences, fields Karina had been passionate about. The foundation became a way for the family to channel their grief into something meaningful, something that would carry Karina's legacy forward. The Howard Beach community also rallied around the Vetrano family. Vigils were held to honor Karina's memory, drawing hundreds of residents who came to light candles, share stories, and offer their support. The park where Karina had lost her life, once a place of fear and suspicion, began to be reclaimed by the community. Local leaders worked to improve lighting and increase patrols, transforming the trails into a safer space for everyone. It was a small but significant step toward healing. Meanwhile, the debate surrounding the case and its broader implications continued to ripple through the city. Chanel Lewis' conviction had brought a measure of closure, but it had also sparked controversy. Some questioned the role of race and socioeconomic status in the investigation, arguing that Chanel's background had made him an easy target. Others pointed to the reliability of DNA evidence, particularly in cases where no witnesses or direct physical evidence linked the suspect to the crime scene. The case became a lightning rod for discussions about justice, fairness, and the evolving role of forensic science. For the detectives who had worked tirelessly to solve Karina's case, the resolution was a source of pride, but also a sobering reminder of the challenges they faced daily. The murder of Karina Vetrano had been a high-profile case, one that had consumed resources and attention for years. But it was just one of many. Each unsolved case on their desks represented another family waiting for answers, another community seeking justice. The lessons they had learned from Karina's case about persistence, collaboration, and the power of forensic technology would inform their work moving forward. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the courtroom and the community. Karina's story inspired a renewed focus on safety measures for runners and outdoor enthusiasts. Apps and devices designed to enhance personal safety saw a surge in popularity, with features like GPS tracking, emergency alerts, and audio monitoring becoming standard. Organizations dedicated to empowering women through self-defense training and safety education also experienced a surge in support, their messages amplified by the awareness Karina's case had generated. For those closest to Karina, life after the trial became a delicate balance of moving forward while honoring her memory. Her friends gathered regularly, sharing stories and reminiscing about the person who had touched their lives so deeply. They spoke of her humor, her kindness, and her boundless energy, ensuring that the essence of who she was would never be forgotten. Phil and Kathy often visited Karina's favorite places, finding comfort in the spaces that had brought her joy. The beach where she had spent so many summer afternoons, the cafe where she had written in her journal, the trail she had run. Each location became a point of connection, a way to feel her presence even in her absence. The years that followed were not without challenges. The Vetrano family continued to navigate their grief, the milestones and anniversaries serving as bittersweet reminders of all that had been lost. But through their pain, they found strength in their shared mission to ensure that Karina's life and legacy would continue to inspire others. Karina's story became a symbol of resilience and community. It was a story that underscored the importance of vigilance, the power of science, and the enduring impact of love. Her name became synonymous with action, advocating for safety, supporting young women, and reminding the world of the importance of remembering those we've lost. In the end, Karina Vetrano's life was one of connection, creativity, and compassion. While her time was tragically cut short, the ripples of her impact continued to spread, touching lives in ways that even she could never have imagined. For her family, her friends, and her community, Karina's legacy was not defined by how her life ended, but by the extraordinary person she was and the light she left behind. And in that light, her memory would shine forever. If these stories left you reflecting on the fragility of life and the dangers faced even during ordinary routines, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of our daily uploads. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How can we create safer communities and honor the lives of these young women? Thank you for watching, and remember, awareness and vigilance can make all the difference. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.